Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome for everyone to the Courtauld Center for American Art Research seminar series. We're very delighted to have a speaker this evening, Samantha Noel, who will be talking to us about material related to her recently published excellent book, Tropical Aesthetics of Black Modernism. I'll hold it up here, which was published earlier this year, back in the late winter, early spring by Duke University Press. So a really amazing new book that we can't wait to hear about. I'm not going to introduce Samantha this evening. To close out our calendar year of events, I'm delighted to invite Madeline Harrison, colleague at the Courtauld, associate lecturer and expert in American art of the early 20th century, especially works of the Harlem Renaissance, and some interesting intersections and correspondences with Samantha's work, I'm sure, and I'm delighted to have hear them in conversation afterwards. And obviously we always invite your own questions as well, so do pop those in the chat and we'll get some of those to Samantha in 15 minutes or so of questions after the talk is concluded. Thanks so much for coming, and please do keep checking our website. We've got more and more events coming online. As we move into the new year, we've got an exciting roster of events coming up, including talks on Jean-Michel Basquiat, on 19th century landscape painting and the construction of race, on curating African American art and modernism. So there's a real interesting, diverse range of talks coming up. But for now, I'm delighted to turn over to Maddie, who will be introducing Samantha, and please enjoy the talk, and merry season and festivities to all. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Oh, yes, thank you so much, Tom. Hi, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome virtually to the Center for American Art at the Courtauld. I'd like to really echo Tom's excitement to have Samantha Noel talking to us today, and it's really lovely to see so many attendees here for this really fantastic event, which closes out our calendar for this calendar year. I'm really delighted to be chairing tonight. As Tom said, my name is Madeline Harrison. I'm an associate lecturer here at the Courtauld. I work on the Harlem Renaissance, broadly conceived as my research focus. So it's a real privilege for me to be chairing our event tonight with Professor Noel, whose research has been really enriching for me, for my own research in recent years, and who I'll now briefly introduce before handing over to her. I should say as well that, as Tom said, the chat will be open throughout the talk. So please drop any and all questions you have in there, and I will get to as many of them as possible at the end. So our speaker tonight is Samantha Noel, who is an associate professor of art history at Wayne State University. She received her BA in fine art from Brooklyn College at the City University of New York, and her MA and PhD in art history from Duke University. Her research interests revolve around the history of art, visual culture, and performance of the Black diaspora. She's published on Black modern contemporary art and performance in journals such as Small Axe, Third Text, and Art Journal. Noel's book, Tropical Aesthetics of Black Modernism, which was published with Duke University Press in February 2021, offers a thorough investigation of how Caribbean and American artists of the early 20th century were responding to colonial and hegemonic regimes through visual and performative tropicalist representation. It privileges the land and how a sense of place is critical in the identity formation of early 20th century artists, as well as their creative processes. Noel is working on a new book tentatively titled Diasporic Art in the Age of Black Power. This book seeks to examine the impact of the Black Power movement on visual art as it emerged in the political, historical, and social context of the United States of America and the Anglophone Caribbean in the 1960s and 1970s. Noel is the 2021 to 2022 Smithsonian Terra Foundation Senior Fellow in American Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and her research has also been supported by the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Moreau Postdoctoral Fellowship at the University of Notre Dame. She's also received a number of grants and fellowships from Wayne State University. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Noel, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Madeline. And I'd also like to thank Tom D, as well as David Peters Corbett, for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really so excited about sharing my research with you all, and I look forward to comments and questions at the end. So let me just begin by sharing my screen. All right. Well, to start off, this talk, I think it's only fitting that I talk about where the inspiration came from. And as a graduate student, as well as a newly minted assistant professor, you know, working on my research throughout all of these years, you know, in the US, of course, one of the major institutions that one would go to do research, particularly since you, if you're doing research on any part of the Black diaspora, is the Schomburg Center. It's the Harlem division of the New York Public Library system, and of course, in the reading room for the at the Schomburg Center, you know, that is where you would see these beautiful murals created by Aaron Douglas. And it always piqued my interest, certainly continued to pique my interest after learning about his works in you know, classes throughout my you know, my studies. And it's continued to always be you know, a great curiosity to me. And you know, I think one of the things, you know, well, certainly one of the main reasons why I was so curious about these murals is, you know, obviously, as I wrote about in my book, the presence of the banana tree. And of course, if you are a student of Caribbean modernism, you know that the banana tree was very symbolic of you know, Caribbeanness, if you will, and notions of cultural nationalism in the early 20th century. But then I also was quite curious about and very much interested in the art of John Dunkley. I wanted to write about his work, but I you know, in my book, but I didn't really I couldn't really quite figure out how to you know, it just wasn't you know, it just didn't really materialize to become part of the project. I mean, I think it's definitely something that I would like to write about, the art of John Dunkley, particularly after I saw that amazing retrospective at the Perez Art Museum in Miami, Florida, but it just never really materialized. And I felt it didn't really fit into what I was thinking about and envisaged for the book itself. And certainly, you know, Wifredo Lamb's arts, without a doubt, was particularly his iconic The Jungle painting was definitely a work that was, I felt, in many ways parallel and intersect with conceptually with the writings of well, the works and even the writings of Douglas in terms of his development as an artist, when reading, you know, about him and writings that he did in archives. So you know, it's, you know, so essentially, you know, when I was thinking about the book and the various chapters, without question, Douglas and Lamb fit in perfectly. And I also wanted to consider performance as well, since I did my dissertation on Carnival and utilizing performance art theory, and as well as the theory of visual culture in that dissertation. So I, you know, obviously I will definitely talk more about the different chapters later on in the talk. But in terms of developing my theoretical framework for the book, you know, reading Krista Thompson's An Eye for the Tropics, a book that came out in 2006, you know, that this book was really, really important for, you know, in my development of my notion of tropical aesthetics, right? Particularly her exploration of, you know, these idealized perceptions of the tropics that influence how natural landscapes in tropical parts of the world were reconstituted to meet Western expectations of a tropical paradise, right? Thompson defines such constructions of place images as they pertain to the Anglophone Caribbean as tropicalization. And that term refers to this complex these complex visual systems through which the islands were imaged for tourist consumption, and the social and political implications of these representations and actual physical space on the islands and their inhabitants, right? So, you know, she, in the book, of course, she considers the, you know, this burgeoning tourism industry, right? And the, you know, the ideas and aspirations of hoteliers, colonial administrations, and local white mercantile elites who physically transformed or tropicalized many aspects of the islands so that they mimicked these picturesque photographic representations created by photographers from the UK, from America, as well as local photographers that really became symbolic of specific islands, but particularly she focuses on the Northern Caribbean. And, you know, essentially, as she explicates in the book, these picturesque images rendered the terrain as rural, exotic, primitive, and unmodern. So it seems really apparent to me that tropical landscapes were very much part of the experience of not only African Caribbean peoples, but also African Americans in the early 20th century. But typically any discussion of this scholarship was often cursory. To me, there was something there that needed to be explored further. So apart from the work of Thompson, there were other important texts that offered substantial scholarship on this notion of tropicality as a social and cultural construct. There is, of course, David C. Miller's Dark Eden, The Swamp in 19th Century American Culture of 1989, David Arnold's The Problem of Nature, Environment, Culture, and European Expansion of 1996, as well as J. Michael Dash's The Other America, Caribbean Literature in a New World Context of 1998. And these were really pivotal, really useful texts for me as I was shaping and forming my theoretical perspective. But still, none of them really offered this thorough investigation of how Caribbean and American artists of the early 20th century were responding to these colonial and hegemonic regimes through visual and performative tropicalist representation. So I really wanted to offer an alternative understanding of the tropics in order to prove how the creative expressions of the likes of Wifredo and Josephine Baker effectively contributed to the development of Black modernity. And so my book grapples with the ways in which visual tropes of tropicality complicated the conveyance of modernity for Black people in different locations throughout the Black Atlantic. And it also examines the creative manifestations of Black modernism in the early 20th century and explicates how tropicality functioned as a key unifying element in African diasporic art in the early 20th century. So this obviously underscores the internationalist ethos of Pan-Africanism prevalent in their works. So, you know, undoubtedly the art of the African diaspora were united in their steadfastness to visualize the complications of Black modernism, and in so doing contributed to an existing global modern art movement. And in the Caribbean, there was, of course, this desire for evidence of Black indigeneity that fueled cultural nationalists and anti-colonialist movements. And this, of course, went hand in hand with substantiating claims that the respective islands of the Anglophone Caribbean, for example, could be self-governed modern nation states. So soon, the iconography that was instituted in artworks became emblematic of Caribbeanness, as well as a particular kind of modern Caribbean aesthetic. So similarly, the development of an aesthetic that reflected the ethos of African American identity was key to the ideological framework of the New Negro movement. Alain Locke, the leading figure of the Harlem Renaissance, as it sometimes is referred to, he expertly recognized a new self-awareness amongst Black Americans that was akin to modernity in the early decades of the 20th century. Yet artists and performers were able to go beyond these nationalist preoccupations and offer through their work a visual rendering of a unified African diasporic experience. And I'm showing here an image of the cover of an exhibition catalog edited by Richard J. Powell. He just happened to be my advisor in graduate school at Duke University, but it's the exhibition Rhapsodies in Black, Art of the Harlem Renaissance. And Powell recognized the diasporic reaches of the Harlem Renaissance, stating that not only African Americans in New York City contributed, but also from other cities in the US, right? And in addition, he also asserts that European Americans, artists, European artists, Caribbean artists were really also pivotal to the evolution of the movement. And that sometimes, before he certainly brought that to, to the forefront in this book, it wasn't really fully acknowledged, the international reaches. I mean, the Harlem Renaissance really was a reflection of the Black internationalism that was already at play during this time period, particularly in major metropolitan centers in the West. So one should also be reminded of the many explorations of the intersection of tropicality and the Black experience of the early 20th century in literature and theater, right? There was a fecundity of tropicality that was present in novels like Cain by Jean Toomer, Porgy by Dubois Hayward, Tropic Death by Guyanese-born Eric Warrand, Banana Bottom by Jamaican born Claude McKay. However, much of these meditations echoed predominant conceptions of the tropical landscape in the Western imaginary. And other early 20th century artists of the Black Atlantic have incorporated tropical aesthetics to expound their experiences of Black modernism. The European American artist Doris Ullman, her photography conveyed how a Southern Black subjectivity hinged with a Southern landscape in photographs like None with Girl, New Orleans, right? There's also the African American artist Richmond Barthay. His sculpture representations of African descended peoples were largely informed by reductive perceptions of Africa and other tropical locations as exotic, yet fearsome. Jamaican sculpture, British Jamaican sculptor Edna Manley, she created arresting carvings that celebrated the Black working class in works such as Negro Arouse. The manifestation of tropicalia and the African-American imaginary of this era emerged in theater productions like Voodoo Macbeth of 1936 and the other theater production, Haiti of 1938. But in The Problem of Nature by David Arnold, he asserts that tropicality is a form of othering that encapsulates an ambivalent body of ideas, representations, and experiences, all of which exist in mental juxtaposition to something else. Or simply stated, tropicality is a social construction rather than a material reality. So historically, when European and European American artists and writers who ventured to tropical zones represented these terrains, their perceptions of the physical arrangements were compounded by projections of values and ideals, as well as certain fears and prejudices. Historian Nancy Lee Stepan reminds us that the word landscape refers to, quote, a manner of perceiving space in terms of a scene situated at a distance from the observer that is rooted in a Western way of organizing the visual field, end quote. And that the, quote, designation of a site as one of nature often results in our ignoring the social matrices that frame or produce it, or the realities and textures of human activities necessary to make it work as a site of nature, end quote. So, it's clear, it was certainly clear for me after reflecting on these writings that the Western way of perceiving the natural environment of the global South very much began in the 15th century and continued to persist well into the 20th century. And in the early 20th century, Black Atlantic artists defied these conventional understandings of tropicalia by representing tropical terrains in art and performance in new and radical ways. In the vein of art historians such as Kabina Musa, Laurie Stokes Sims argues that for Black artists, modernism affirmed the notion that a modern individual could be an agent of change or transformation, whereas for white artists, modernism was reflected in the breakdown of the representational and the familiar in literature and art. For Black artists, that rupture represented a potential revolution in self-definition and self-image as they assumed the role of proactive rather than reactive agents of contemporary society, end quote. So these artists, oh dear. Okay, so these artists employed what I call tropical aesthetics in an effort to enact a naming of place. Women studies scholar Catherine McKittrick asserts that such naming, quote, regardless of expressive method and technique, is also a process of self-assertion and humanization, end quote. The tropical aesthetics that these artists and performers use function in this vein, proving to be an aesthetic that makes possible what McKittrick calls a sayability of geography that enables agency. There is no aspiration for, quote, material ownership and Black repossession, but rather, as McKittrick says, a grammar of liberation, end quote. Tropical aesthetics has allowed these artists to visually articulate a different way of knowing and imagining the world, since geography in a material and discursive sense is never fully secure, given that three-dimensional space is socially produced. The idea that belonging to a place could lead to socio-spatial liberation is seldom realized for many Black people. So due to these limitations, tropical aesthetics allows for a critical imaging and reclaiming of space through art. And through art, one can reify social geographies through the manifestation of what McKittrick calls alternative geographic formations. Indeed, as the artists and performers explored in this book have proven, art can bring into fruition a different sense of place. So I will be going through the different chapters of the book, but I will focus more on the chapters that are America-centered, since this is a talk given at the Center for American Art. So I'll begin with the Aaron Douglas chapter. And so just as I mentioned before, the flora in Douglas's work was of particular interest to me. And, one significant point I observed, of course, about his work was the banana tree, but its first appearance in his art was really in the Emperor Jones series. And I think I should, oh, my mistake, that should not be there, but yeah, so it's in the, these two works from the Emperor Jones series. And I thought that perhaps his impetus for including the crop in his mural series started with this work, which was set in Haiti. And this is also around the time that he is working with the German graphic artist Vinald Rice. And a key challenge for me was explicating Douglas's relationship with the tropical terrain that did not really sound essentialist. So as Stephanie Lee-Baptiste and others have pointed out, Stephanie Lee-Baptiste is a performance studies scholar. She and others have discussed in their scholarship the fact that American Blacks in the early 20th century possessed a sense of racial exceptionalism that revolved around their American national identity, and that they subscribed to theories that associated racial development and attainment of civilization with the temperate zones of the world, more specifically the West. However, Douglas's views on the Pan-Africanism movement, as well as the influence of Alain Locke's championing of classical African art in his essay, The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts, would have informed Douglas's approach to conveying Africanisms and the tropical terrain in his art. In fact, one can associate Douglas's tropical landscapes as evocations of Africa. Douglas's interest in African art was closely linked to his desire to reach the common man and his belief that through art, Black people could begin the process of discovering their African roots. So Douglas's stylized actualizations of the American landscape in his many noted works, with their silhouetted subjects interspersed throughout them, are also wholly strategic in relaying the crucial role African Americans played in the nurturing and the development of quote unquote God's nature. And this artistic celebration of the American terrain has its roots, of course, in the Hudson River School, the group of New York City-based landscape painters whose works characterize a quintessential American artistry in the mid-19th century. And members of the Hudson River School contributed to a nationalistic project that identified America's destiny with the American landscape. So this terrain, however, was considered the birthright to only the Anglo-Saxon portion of the American populace. Yet it is clear that not only American artists of European descent were preoccupied with territorial expansion and its correlating ideas of freedom and upward social mobility, African American artists also responded to this glorification of the American landscape. And one such artist was Robert S. Duncanson, whose Blue Hole Floodwaters, Little Miami River, provides an alternative meditation on the American terrain. So a tributary of the Ohio River, Little Miami River was a popular site for many regional artists. The setting of the painting was also a preferred escape route for fugitive slaves. Duncanson's portrayal of the Little Miami River not only offers the viewer a picturesque perspective of this beloved destination, but it also bears socio-political commentary. Certainly, the early signs of industrialization on a site that was a popular escape route for fugitive slaves is an artistic beckoning for the geographic and economic reclamation for the centuries of toiling on land that enslaved Africans could never claim as their own. So just move on to this slide. So just as Duncanson's art offered different means of relating to one's environment, Douglas's second panel of the Aesthetics of Negro Life series, From Slavery to Reconstruction, featured imaginings of expansion and possibility for Southern African Americans living in the years after slavery. This composition simultaneously conveys two pivotal events of African American history, slavery and the Reconstruction period. And it features Douglas's signature silhouetted human figures that recall ancient Egyptian wall paintings, the concentric circles that aid in highlighting focal points in his paintings, and the artist's monochromatic color palette. So while Douglas's landscapes in his compositions were less panoramic and had a greater human presence than those of Duncanson, they nonetheless reflected the intersectionalities of open spaces and a sense of freedom, as discussed earlier. Duncanson's legacy is evident in Douglas's work, and the latter continued his project of producing spaces that are not deemed as belonging to Black people, thereby producing their meaning, their significance. This creative production of space functions as a kind of process of reclamation, however imaginative it may appear to be. And it is feasible to discern that Douglas wanted his natural, It's feasible to discern that Douglas wanted his natural landscapes to be reminiscent of not only the South, but also tropical Africa, as well as other tropical parts of the Black Atlantic. This is telling in his conveyance of the topography of the American landscape. In many of his compositions, they do not appear to be quintessentially American, particularly with the inclusion of banana leaves, like we see on the top right corner of this work. Due to the relocation of tropical plants throughout various parts of the tropical world via colonialism, the presence of a banana tree in the southern United States proves how interconnected it is to the Caribbean archipelago. Furthermore, the inclusion of the banana leaves is a reminder of the shared histories of slavery and the inevitable cross-cultural exchanges in the region. The iconographic banana tree in Douglas's art functions as a common thread that symbolically connects African America to the African Caribbean, as well as the African continent. Douglas proved how visual art gave African Americans the opportunity to imagine their worlds. Leaders of the Pan-Africanism movement championed the cause for improving the well-being of people of African descent around the world. The more radical thinkers of the movement imagined the possibilities of political autonomy and self-governance. As mentioned earlier, since Haiti epitomized this ideal, the country became somewhat of a central focus in the early 20th century. It thus comes as no surprise that Douglas would want to create a mural commemorating the Haitian terrain. Douglas painted the Haitian mural for the home of Grace Goins in Wilmington, Delaware in 1942. The composition features a lush tropical landscape replete with a variety of flora, including a number of banana trees with male and female subjects, 3 of whom are market women with large baskets of fresh produce on their heads. The black market woman rather, has been the visual companion of tropical nature as early as the late 19th century. Also of note is a sculptural form highlighted with a man playing a large drum in its direction. The sculptural figure is similar to the one seen in The Negro in an African Setting from the Aspects of Negro Life series. This dialogic gesture not only visually parallels the 2 compositions, but it also establishes Haiti as an extension of Africa that is in close proximity to the United States. Douglas's inclusion of the figure reflects a certain adherence to primitivism, which was the case for a number of visual artists of the New Negro movement. So by subscribing to this discourse, so very prevalent in European modern art and culture, Douglas aims to highlight the cultural differences between Haitians and Black Americans. At the same time, the presence of the sculptural figure serves as a symbolic register of Haiti's centrality in Pan-Africanist thought. I wanted to mention that I thought of the possibility of examining Douglas's work in conjunction with muralism in the early 20th century. And I also thought about considering, discussing the influence of Mexican muralism that was so very prevalent during that time. And particularly when we think of the impact of Mexican muralism amongst artists throughout the US, but no doubt artists who were historically marginalized and part of marginalized racial groups. But, in this chapter, I did not examine in great detail Douglas's interest in Marxism, as well as his association with the American Communist Party and how all of this manifested in his art. I really do think that these ideas would have taken the chapter in a different trajectory. But I mean, I guess it's just one of those things, right? You always think of certain points that you want to explore in a chapter in a book, but that would mean that the manuscript will never end, right? But I mean, these are definitely points of and ideas and certain topics that are still, very important and worthwhile to consider. And certainly other, in different capacities, other scholars have considered these points as they pertain to Douglas's work. So I'm now going to move on to the Wifredo Lamb chapter, but I won't be focusing too much on this chapter, as well as the chapter on Carnival. And so essentially, let me just show the Lamb work, right? So, particularly for the Lamb chapter, the J. Michael Dash book, The Other America, Caribbean literature in a New World context was really, really helpful in the framing of my ideas, my theoretical ideas for this chapter. Dash considers the framing of the Caribbean as a fictive space, a terra firma that was subject to reinvention. And he reminds us that the unstable nature of meaning leads to reinvention in the New World, so much so that, quote, geographical space, landscape, and human communities are inscribed with the rhetoric and images of given discursive practices, end quote. So for him, the fragility and openness of the broken chain of islands that make up the Caribbean archipelago makes it susceptible to control. Apart from recognizing how the landscape is inscribed so that it becomes something else, what is crucial in Dash's assessment of the reinvention of the New World is the acknowledgement that even Caribbean people are implicated in this invented rendering. So emerging as an ideological construct of colonial conquest and exploitation, Black people were represented as the primitive racial other who lived in a state of timelessness, not evolving or changing, but rather existing in an inferior culture. As a result, Caribbean people were, and to a lesser extent, well, to a greater extent, still are viewed in close relation with the scenery that surrounds them. And as a negritude writer from Martinique, René Menil attests, they eventually are viewed as part of the scenery, as objects, as decor. So the chapter ultimately proved how Lam's art conjured a world that was decidedly Caribbean, using the Western pictorial tradition as a point of departure. Surrealism provided the means for Lam's reinvention of the Cuban landscape and the depiction of the Cuban worldview in general. And Lam was the first artist whose art featured Black Cuban culture as a decisive factor of expression, and visually exploring the Black Cuban spirit was a vital part of his oeuvre. And negritude provided an ideological framework through which he could develop the art he created in Cuba, particularly since for Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, the political, cultural, and spiritual identity of modern Black people is inherently connected to the terrain. And they were a great source of inspiration for him as he was journeying to Cuba from war-torn Europe, you know, making that stop in Martinique and having that once in a lifetime encounter with the Césaires, as well as René Menil and others. And you know, in the chapter on Trinidad Carnival, really quickly, in the same way that Lam's and Douglas's artworks allow for the full realization of the struggle for socio-spatial liberation, festival traditions made these efforts more palpable through the reveling and sometimes contentious encounters of masqueraders in real time and space. So this chapter examined the performances of early 20th century masqueraders of Trinidad. In particular, it considers the history and evolution of the Jamet figure in Trinidad Carnival during this historical moment, and how the term became a strategically gender descriptor for women of a certain race, class, and deportment. Although the social classification of Jamet was oppressive, it nonetheless empowered these women by prompting the Jamet to be more defiant than ever. Despite the oppressive tactics of the police and ultimately the colonial authorities, Jamets developed a different sense of place that allowed them to discover possibilities in the existing landscapes that would counter geographic domination. And they also found resolve in the proliferation of Ethiopianism and Garveyism, as well as the labor movement that dealt specifically with issues that working men and women faced, as well as the anti-colonialism movement. And the chapter explicates how Trinidad Carnival engendered a type of corporeal expression that, while on the one hand is creatively oriented, it is on the other hand political in its affect as a strategy of space making. So I consider how Carnival provided a visceral means of enacting tropical modernism by performatively reclaiming the land belonging to the colonizer, while also engaging directly with the tropical terrain. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the chapter on Josephine Baker and Maya Angelou. So one phenomenon of the early 20th century Black experience I was struck by when working on this chapter was that although Pan-Africanism informed the ways in which African American performers claimed an affinity with Black people in other parts of the world, American Blacks possessed a sense of racial exceptionalism, as it is discussed earlier, right? And so, you know, in this chapter, I examine the ways in which, yes, I do want to mention though that, you know, despite the sense of exceptionalism, racial exceptionalism that African Americans possessed, Stephanie Lee Batiste, she does say that these representations demonstrated an outward seeking for identity and affiliation with extra national Blacks, since African Americans use primitivism in an imperial manner to establish national belonging, alterity, and representational power, right? And this very much informs and, you know, really helped me explicate and explore this interesting phenomenon of, you know, African-American performers performing as the racialized other who was not often from the global South. Right, so in this chapter, I examine the ways in which early 20th century Black Atlantic performers like Josephine Baker and Maya Angelou, they essentially are highlighting the internationalist ethos of Pan-Africanism through their corporeal veneration of tropicality. So I consider how these performers reproduced imperial identities of Black people who lived in these tropical terrains, even while contesting and undermining conventional understandings of them. And the movement of these African-American performers within and beyond the center of power enabled a transformation of corporeal expression, particularly as it pertained to space making and notions of belonging. So I'll, you know, just quickly go over the Maya Angelou section. And, you know, I always was curious about Maya Angelou's career as a singer and dancer, particularly her career as a calypso cabaret performer. I don't think a lot of people know about that really fascinating part of her life, because it unfortunately has hardly ever been written about that much. So I felt compelled to write about her performances and also about her songwriting for her Calypso album, since it clearly is this interesting prelude to her career as a writer and poet. So after Angelou's efforts to sustain employment in the world of dance failed, when she was really pursuing this career as a dancer, she even at one time early in her dancing career was part of a dancing duo with Alvin Ailey, of all people, which is quite impressive. So after that, you know, those efforts failed, she set her sights on cabaret performance when she started performing as a calypso singer in 1953 at the Purple Onion, which was a famous basement cabaret in San Francisco. So in an effort to make her stage persona more intriguing, Angelou's friends thought it best to change her name and even created a new, more exotic biographical narrative, as well as coined the stage name for her, Maya Angelou. So her birth name was Margaret Johnson, but you know, she was married to you know, a Greek American man, and then her brother, whose last name was Angelos, and her brother's pet name for her was Maya. So they, you know, came up with this with the stage name Maya Angelou, which she kept you know, until the very end. But her review at the Purple Onion led to other performance opportunities, most notably as a featured dancer in the opera Porgy and Bess during its European tour from 1954 to 1955. And once home, Angelou focused on mothering her then 10-year-old son and then finding employment. And this was around the time of the second boom of America's calypso craze, with much of the fanfare revolving around Harry Belafonte, who was an American entertainer of Jamaican parentage. And he was also labeled the king of calypso. And this, of course, was much to the chagrin of calypsonians from Trinidad, the musical genre's country of origin. So calypso entertainers were consistently packaged as exoticized dark-skinned caricatures whose stage performances for white audiences relegated them to the servitude typical in Caribbean tourist destinations. Dressed in bright-colored tattered clothing and straw hats, these performers were expected to portray the light-hearted poverty, innocence, and rusticity that Americans believed Caribbean Blacks possessed. In 1957, Angelou recorded her only album titled Miss Calypso that included her own songs as well as standards. The imagery and the cover of Miss Calypso and the promotional photograph provide a visual equivalence to her lively singing, as well as the melodic and rhythmic structure of the songs in the album. Both images are set in what appears to be a simulated jungle scene. Angelou is conveyed as an archetypical exotic woman in a revealing red dress, as we could see here on the cover of her album. And here she's portrayed cavorting around a large bonfire with one lunge leg exposed and bearing the body toward the camera. Her skin is glistening, illuminating the musculature and brown skin tone of her slender body. Her arms are bent and her fingers all point outward, invoking action. And along with her slightly open mouth, her open yet smiling mouth, right? She's definitely suggesting, that she is in the middle of a performance around this fire. The same themes prevail in the promotional photograph. Here, the iridescent yellow shell of the dress is visible and echoes the yellow hue of the fire. In both images, Angelou is rendered as a savage and sexual deviant. Her Black female body, illuminated by a fire and nestled in a dark jungle, thick with foliage, epitomizes the notion of the Black hypersexualized primitive in her natural habitat. Given her artificial biographical narrative, her West Indian otherness situates her in the lower strata of imperialist relations of power. The colonialist dynamic is intensified even further if the viewer takes on a masculinist gaze, which reduces her to a feminized object who is rendered as picturesque as the environment that surrounds her. Yet her projected image was complicated by some of the lyrics in the songs she performed, many of which were featured in her album. In Ranjo, the lyrics speak to the African continuum of divination systems of a number of sub-Saharan African religions that have been retained throughout the Americas. More importantly, there are significant parts of the counter ideologies created by Black people for Black people that were often subjugated by the status quo throughout history. In the song Mambo in Africa, the lyrics tell of the popularity of Mambo in different parts of the Black diaspora, while also bringing to mind the disparate cultural forms that brought into being this beloved musical and dance genre. More importantly, Angelou establishes a link between Mambo and the African continent in an effort to venerate what she deems as a significant source of this diasporic cultural derivative. Despite the colonial exoticism embedded in the composition of the promotional photograph, and to a lesser extent the music of the album, Angelou's performance of the songs utilized tropical aesthetics to establish a linkage between the body and the land. More than anything, this embodied tropicality ritualistically manifests the social, economic, and political aspirations that Black Atlantic peoples envisioned for themselves. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the Josephine Baker section of the chapter. So when pursuing research for this section, And this section primarily focused on Baker's performances in Paris in the 1920s. One of course had to look to the cabaret venues of 1920s New York City. And I was curious about Carolyn Dudley Reagan, who created the European-American woman who created La Revue Negre, right? This is Baker's first show in Paris. And I was curious about why she wanted to create such a show. And it's really clear that the cabarets and nightclubs of 1920s New York City inspired her. And Baker was discovered by Reagan in one such cabaret venue in New York, the Plantation Club of Midtown Manhattan. And these venues, such as the famed Cotton Club, they all have names that recall the antebellum South. And the names of the venues, along with the interior design, the set design, the choreography of the dancers, the costuming, they were essentially represented in La Revue Negre, right? The show in Paris. And without question, they invoked the tropics. All of this was fascinating to me. And so I really wanted to unpack and explore these phenomena in the chapter. So premiering in 1925 with 25 musicians and artists, La Revue Negre consisted of 7 acts: Mississippi Steamboat Race, New York Skyscraper, Louisiana Camp Meeting, Les Strutting Babies, Darky Impressions, Les Pierres qui Parlent, and Charleston Cabaret. And each act stereotypically highlighted a trait often associated with the soul of Black people. And it's stereotypes, of course, like idleness, melancholy, religious fervor, and sexual ecstasy. So particularly interesting is the invocation of locality in the names of most of the 7 acts. They are named after places like Louisiana and Charleston that have long histories of slavery and colonialist oppression in the United States. And more importantly, in locations that are situated within the tropical and subtropical zones of the world. The set designs, costuming, musical accompaniment, and choreography of the performances all worked in concert to illuminate the supposed inherent linkage between Black bodies and the tropical zone. So the notion of the tropics as a hot and torrid zone is what the Parisian audience reacted to upon seeing Josephine Baker and Jo Alex perform their act Danse des Sauvages in La Revue Negre. The sexually charged performance closed the show and featured Baker and Alex in revealing costumes, with Baker wearing a feather miniskirt and feathers on her wrists and ankles. The dance gave emphasis to the hypersexualization prescribed to Black people, with the conveyance of tropical Africa in various elements of the production, all serving to strengthen this representation. In 1926, Baker began her residency at the Folies Bergère, where she first wore the infamous banana skirt, as you could see here in this image. And this is from the production La Folie du Jour. In this jungle spectacle, she wore bracelets and beaded necklaces and a collection of realistic looking bananas fastened around a waistband. She then performed popular dances like the Charleston and the Black Bottom. The emphasis, however, lay on undulated pelvic movements. And as Baker explained, the banana skirt, quote, slung around my hips to accentuate my forward and backward movements, end quote. Although the multiple phalli of the skirt at once signify a dichotomy of the effeminization of the Black male through castration, and alternatively, his inherent hypermasculinization, her performance successfully emphasizes an appropriation of masculinity while also challenging heteronormativity. So when considering the set design for La Folie du Jour, one can acknowledge how this replicated terrain conjures the idea of Africa as a homeland that connected Black people of all nationalities, like those living in Paris, and signifies the possibility of Black sovereignty. This surreptitious ode to Africa reinstates the truth that all African-descended people in and out of the continent persistently engage in modern life. The popular dances Baker sampled during her performances proved to be just as effective in demystifying the Black body's relation with tropical and subtropical landscapes. Most, if not all, of the popular dances that Baker appropriated in her performances, like the Charleston and the cakewalk, were rooted in the long-standing tradition during the 18th and 19th centuries of enslaved African Americans parodying the music and dancing of their white masters. As literary scholar Michael Burschuk argues, in the spirit of slaves parodying the dances and actions of their masters, the Charleston does not highlight, quote, the failure for the Black performer to emulate the innate grace of whites, but rather the performer's movements instead exaggerate white sophistication itself as affected instead of inherent, end quote. So Josephine Baker continued this tradition in her performances by expanding on the parodying of white affectations that ultimately called into question the notion of white superiority. So indeed, the transformation of the French music hall into the ungeographic domain of the jungle via the sound of jazz music, the jungle imagery of the set design, and the frenzied dancing of Black performers all worked in concert to bring into fruition the world of mythic Black primitivism. Every night, the music hall des Champs-Élysées essentially became a simulated version of the imagined primitivist Africa and the southern United States. There was something carnivalesque and parodying about these jungle spectacles, especially since Paris was a Black transnation all its own, while performers adhered to the desired misrepresentations of Blackness that the white audiences wanted to see. After curtain call, they would go to neighborhoods like Montmartre and Montparnasse, where Black modernity was fully practiced and embodied. By the 1920s, the number of Black entertainers traveling from the US increased significantly. And there were also performers coming from the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. So I think I'll end here because I think I went a little over time. But yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So I'll just stop the share of my screen now.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for a brilliantly illuminating and enriching talk. I so enjoyed it. The chat is open for questions, and I can see a few coming in now, which is brilliant. Please do continue to offer your questions. I think we have a little time, but I might actually slightly exploit my power as host and jump in to ask a question first. I just wrote my PhD on Douglas, so a lot of my questions revolve around Douglas, to absolutely no one's surprise. And I was really excited to see aspects of Negro life as the kind of first focal point of your talk. And I was wondering about the kind of, I really love the way that you talked about space in Douglas's murals. And I think that space is such an underappreciated and kind of understudied aspect of Douglas's practice. It's so vital for him. And I was wondering kind of how you theorize the dialogue or the kind of conflict, the butting up of spaces against one another in Douglas's works, because there are these kind of tropical aspects and tropical aesthetics that you talk about, particularly in aspects of Negro life, but they also share the picture plane with these kind of very conspicuously urban signifiers, skyscrapers, and kind of Capitol buildings. And I was wondering kind of how you see Douglas's work as navigating perhaps between these two different paradigms of modernity, perhaps the kind of tropical modernism that you talk about and the more kind of, I suppose we could say, classical modernism that has that more kind of urban element.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, it's worth, recognizing, and, I definitely do that in the book, thinking about Douglas's biography and the fact that he's from Kansas. Now, I've never been to Kansas, but I have read about particularly scholars, they're reflecting on the, these very wide open spaces and these, large plains. I mean, because it's primarily flat land, right? It's in the Midwest, you know, and certainly during that time when he grew up in the late 19th century, early 20th century, right? I mean, it definitely was more space than and perhaps less people. You know, I'm assuming that the US population wasn't as populous then as it is now. So I could imagine, you know, as you know, a Black American man in Kansas and thinking about the history of you know, that migration of people from the South, right, to places, you know, like in the Midwest, like Kansas. You know, I imagine that I think that I definitely wanted, it was important for me to sort of, to be conscious of that and to reflect on that, because I think, you know, that sense of, you know, there are definitely parts of the tropical world that are quite mountainous, and even certain parts of the US that are mountainous, right? But, you know, his compositions and his renderings of the natural landscape are so emphatically, so obviously like flats, and you know, and you do, I think there, you know, it's interesting to reflect on his history and the part of America that he's from, and how it you know, it is reflected in his work and in his rendering of the natural space. And you know, it's true what you said about, you know, modernism and the association of modernity with urbanity, right? Because that is so often what, you know, we learn about when thinking about modern arts, right, during that era. And so, you know, that's why I really was, you know, I really wanted to kind of challenge that, particularly since people often associate nature and you know, the representation of nature, particularly in the way in which you know, Douglas represented it, but not only that, you know, the you know, just tropical parts of the world, you know, often being associated with the natural landscape, and you know, parts of the global south, you know, that are tropical, primarily being seen as not, you know, at the antithesis of modernity. And so, you know, I wanted to challenge that tendency in Western thought, and even in this understanding of modernism, and you know, for us to think beyond you know, urban spaces. I mean, and it's interesting to think about that now, and you know, to have a kind of affinity, especially given the environmental crises and the climate crisis that we are experiencing right now, and people reflecting on nature and hearkening back to nature, right? But you know, I think essentially, you know, artists like Douglas and Wifredo Lamb, I think they were recognizing, you know, in the early 20th century, while there was this, you know, reverence towards urbanity, you know, this, they were revering nature in their works, you know, and, you know, not to, you know, like, you know, go out on a tangent with Lamb, but, you know, I think it's quite interesting. A lesser known painting that Wifredo Lamb did in the 1940s, around the time that he did The Jungle, he has a work entitled Havana, well, Habana, you know, the Spanish spelling, but it's not a cityscape that we see, but it's actually just like, you know, like a natural environment that he depicts, you know. And I think in the same way, you know, we do see Douglas rendering and portraying urban scapes and, you know, tall buildings. And, you know, I'm trying to, I can't remember the particular painting that he did. I don't think it's not part of the Aesthetics of Negro Life, but it's another painting that he did that shows cityscapes, and it even features like, you know, like ancient Egyptian, yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but
it's building more stately mansions.
Yes, thank you. Exactly. Right. But you know, and I talk about that in the chapter as well, right? You know, that he is certainly trying to recognize, you know, like African civilizations and their contributions to notions around, you know, like progress and so forth. But also, you know, in an interesting way, he's you know, he is intersecting the past with the present and thinking about future generations as well, right? You know, that sense of you know, the Black speculative and that work. But you know, even, you know, so that's an interesting counterpart to other works that feature entirely natural landscapes. But that's really something that I wanted to really challenge, because I think it, particularly with regards to the modern arts, I don't think representations of nature, but particularly as they pertain to the Black body, were fully explored, but particularly tropical renderings, because I don't, I was seeing it, in Douglas's work, or even like in the other artworks that I mentioned early in the talk, and I talk about it in the book. But I felt like I was the only person seeing it, and I maybe felt it was of importance. But I really thought that there was something there, right, that needed to be untapped, and maybe it was a kind of sensibility that existed in the early 20th century that I think in some ways were connected to Pan-Africanism, but and this larger sense of Blackness that was beyond the like the parameters of various countries. But I think that's really the impetus, one of the impetus that I had for the book. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's brilliant. That's a great answer to my question. I'll turn to the chat, where we've got lots of thanks, lots of compliments coming, which is lovely. Karen Siraki would like to ask, what does Samantha think of Josephine Baker being recently reburied in the Pantheon? Is this more reinforcement of white Western visual tropes?
Wow. I saw that in the news recently, and I haven't had time to think about that, but it was interesting that they did literally dig up her remains, and so placed her in that mausoleum. And it's interesting because in a sense, they are, literally in a very official and formal and, patriotic way, nationalist way, or, kind of like embedding her body and her remains, right, into the, the French terrain, right, and and very much that is so closely hinged to this kind of, this reference of her as a heroic figure, right, as contributing so much to the French Republic. So that is something that's quite fascinating, because that is quite a recent occurrence, and so I haven't given it much thought, but I was quite fascinated by that. Yeah,
brilliant, thank you. We've also got a question from Adam Freeman, who asks, you mentioned Black mythic primitivism. I know this may be considered a banal question in consideration of your presentation. All questions are great. But I immediately questioned whether films like Black Panther could be considered as representative of such, or is it the opposite?
The Black Panther film, and so that's the I guess the Marvel comics, I guess that Black Panther, yeah. I remember when that came out and how excited people were, but I think so much of authorship, and not to say that only Black people could write about Black people, but it's interesting that graphic novel, which eventually became this movie, it's speaking, it revolves around a particular comic character, but one can't help but think about the fact that it is the name of this organization that was once seen as a terrorist organization in the US, right? But it very much was an organization that emerged during the Black Power movement. But yeah, I mean, I think in a particular way there is, given the framing of the question and thinking about this kind of, I guess the question was about the mythic notion of Black
primitivism, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, recalling, because it has been some time since I saw the film, but it was interesting to see how with the creation and the development of the costuming and even the rendering of the terrain, right, that was all simulated, of course, but it did certainly speak to a particular kind of primitivism, without a doubt. They did their research and looked at very canonical images and like representations of royal figures of different pre-colonial civilizations, right? So there is some appropriation of that, but there's certainly in this particular iteration of the graphic novel, right? As a moving image, as a movie, you know, there definitely was, I got the sense that there was, you know, this intention of at least wanting to, you know, have a film that, you know, because I think it was, you know, by Hollywood standards, it was meant to be this historic film that featured a majority Black cast, but one has to look at like the origins of it, right? And you know, where, you know, and even like the inspiration behind I don't know much about it, but you know, but it is interesting. I think it was a graphic novel that was created sometime in the 60s or something. But yeah, it is interesting to reflect on that, and you know, that there certainly were elements of it that were quite primitivist, right? But one can't help but think about, you know, the fact that it has the same title as this right, this anti-establishment like Black Power era organization that was for the empowerment of Black Americans. Yeah, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Adam is pressing for a kind of, I suppose, a decision. Do you think it was progressive or regressive if you had to come down on one side?
Oh, you mean the film?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess, you know, that's just my opinion, because I've spoken to Black people and even Black children who felt so empowered. But, you know, like from my perspective, I don't know. I think it's just like another peg in the large Hollywood wheel of, you know, the efforts of increasing representation and, you know, diversity in films and so forth. But, you know, yeah, I don't know. I guess, is it progressive, regressive? I'm not sure. I mean, maybe both in certain ways, I guess. Yeah.
It's interesting as well to think about, you know, I saw so many commentaries after that film came out that kind of hailed it as a pioneering work of Afrofuturism. And it's interesting to think about kind of what about it might kind of fall under that umbrella and what might be, you know, labeled as this kind of Black mythic primitivism. It's interesting to think about those kind of different effects that kind of imagery creates.
But then it was so patriarchal in so many ways, right? So yeah.
Absolutely. I wonder if I could ask you another question. I noticed, I was really struck actually by the photograph of Josephine Baker on set, the Folie du Jour set photograph. I noticed there's almost like a visual relation between that and Douglas's work through this framing. A lot of Douglas's work, particularly his murals, employ foliage like these banana leaves, like you talked about, and a few kind of other different like taxonomies, I suppose we could say, that he appears to kind of employ them as a frame. And of course, that's very much what's going on in that Josephine Baker photograph. It seems to kind of create or simulate almost a kind of voyeuristic or theatrical view. And I'm wondering where you see viewership as kind of being situated in the tropical aesthetic as you kind of theorize it. Where do you see viewership as being situated? How do you think that these artists were thinking about the viewership of this aesthetic?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, you know, like, I think that, you know, especially when you read about the artists of the Harlem Renaissance and particularly, you know, the power dynamics that were also at play at the you know, the performance halls in Paris, you know, like they were essentially thinking about the patrons, you know, and you know, there was that really tough ethical sort of like you know, like pondering on who are we making this art for? How much should we appease the patrons or the people who are commissioning works? And I'm thinking about the like the Harman Foundation, for example, and how that was a source of revenue for artists, and many of them ultimately appeased what you know, the white viewers or the white patrons ultimately wanted, right? And so when you talk about that kind of like framing of that particular backdrop from La Folie du Jour, or even, yeah, it's interesting to reflect on like the ways in which even Douglas framed his works and used the foliage to frame the work, right? But it seemed as though those images were created with a particular you know, like framing or lens in mind, right? A particular kind of like viewership that was entirely Eurocentric, particularly since that is how one imagined and envisioned the tropics was through this, white heteronormative lens, right? And so, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember the question. I was going.
No, not at all. It's really interesting to hear you kind of meditate on it. I was just thinking about viewership, and I suppose
viewership, yeah.
We could kind of speculatively say that probably, Baker was performing for a very different kind of audience than the one that Douglas was creating, especially aspects of Negro life for, with the knowledge that was commissioned for the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library.
Right.
Likely that a significant percentage of his viewership would have been Black people living in Harlem, a kind of community that he'd been living in for so long, to become a part of. Yeah,
I mean, definitely, especially with with the likes of Douglas, and because that was part of the WPA, the New Deal project by Roosevelt, right? And so public art, art with the people in mind, with the masses, that they could definitely consume it, digest it, make sense of it, so it could be more accessible. So certainly with Douglas in mind, I mean, that was a particular kind of audience and viewership. But and I think even beyond those works, I mean, I think he was always very conscious and of creating art for Black Americans in mind, and not for other people. But I guess I was thinking of, during that time period, and even the Langston Hughes being outwardly critical of artists, poets, writers, producing works for the white patron, because they are the ones who are patronizing and financing their works. And so I was thinking about Josephine Baker, I guess, in that context, in that larger kind of like framing. But particularly, yes, it is interesting to reflect on the juxtaposition and how the the audiences and the perceived audiences and viewership certainly did differ, with regards to Josephine Baker, kind of trying to in a very expertly kind of parodying way, right? Trying to like appease their expectations and their demands, but still there was something else at play, right? This underpinning of parody, right? And she was continuing this tradition of satire, right? That her enslaved ancestors were very much immersed in, when when they would be singing and dancing, supposedly entertaining their white masters, but really making fun of them. That kind of festive laughter that Bakhtin writes about, right? So yeah,
that's really interesting. Thank you. I think I'll grab one more question from the chat, because we're running to time. We've got a question from Mitsuyo Delcourt. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm wondering if the recognition of African culture is also related to the sustainable awareness. I mean, the relation to nature and time. My Caribbean and African friends have a certain affinity with my Japanese culture in this regard. What do you think?
The relation to time. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if the recognition of African culture is also related to the sustainable awareness, the relation to nature and time.
Nature and time. Yeah. I mean, I think, Douglas's use of African, because I think there, a huge part of his rendering and his utilizing of Africanisms was in part closely, inspired by, just the, larger kind of like framing of Africa as primitive, but then because this certainly began with when he was under the tutelage of Vinald Rice. But then I think, after, perhaps like ruminating with all of these ideas and being exposed to this work, certainly after conversations that he may have had with Du Bois, because he worked with Du Bois at the Crisis periodical, and even perhaps with being in the circles that he was in the Harlem Renaissance, it became something else, and it became more specific to his identity and his sense of an African ancestry. So I think it became less timeless, but I think to a certain extent it was, even though it was quite utopic for him, I think it still was, because of the geographic remove. I think there was an element of utopianism at play, and yeah, and perhaps just a sense of romanticism as well. But because he didn't have the opportunity to go to Africa, but it's interesting to reflect on his when he did that residency in Haiti, and prior to going to Haiti, his renderings of anything dealing with Haiti hugely was hugely transformed once he got there. And this Haiti is being seen as that sort of Africa in closer proximity to the US. So I imagine maybe he would have had the same experience with Africa were he to actually visit there. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's interesting to reflect on how he conveys he plays with ideas around temporality, right? And interestingly connects Africa to the US, right? But because of this clearly that the history of the slave trade and slavery and so forth. But there is that interesting continuum, and that unfortunate part of history that binds these two continents. And so in an interesting way, I think he really does explore that conundrum in his art. So I think in an interesting way there is a particular kind of awareness and reflection on time and space in his art. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, I think so. There's that real kind of sense of a compressed, not only a compressed time, but a compressed space that appears in murals, especially. It's like Africa and the Caribbean and the US, and before the Middle Passage and after the Middle Passage, that kind of all become compressed into this one space that is so interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Thank you. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for such a generative Q&A as well, and thank you for a brilliant conversation, a wonderful talk, a virtual round of applause from everyone.
Oh, thank you. I'll add to it too.
Really amazing compliment to the book. It was really, really fascinating, really great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you next year. Thanks so much. Have a good evening.
Thanks all.
Thank you everyone for coming. Bye.
Bye-bye.